Oops. There we go. How many different hats do you wear? Yeah? What hat are you best known for? Mom? Some for being a good cook? Does that mean sometimes you're known or some people out there are known? I'm sorry?
She said, you're by yourself, period.
Okay.
You gotta come home.
Yeah. What would you like to be best known for? As a good person? I suspect that the answers will vary an awful lot depending on whether or not you are male or female, because I think men want to be best known for something that they do, and women are probably more prone to want to be known for something that they are. Because for men, do and are intertwined, and they identify themselves with what they do, more so than with what they are. When you look at, we're thinking about the book of Samuel, and we're thinking about Samuel himself. So when you look at Samuel, how do you remember Samuel?
I always remember it when the Lord called him and said, I'm here. Here I am, Lord.
Okay. After he figured out, thanks with Eli's help, that it wasn't Eli calling him. What else do you best remember Samuel by?
Because he's the one who was made David king.
Mm-hmm. He anointed two kings, Saul and David. Dan?
He had a very strong beginning, but he had a very weak finish.
He did seem to have a weak finish, yeah. How would you react if I said that every once in a while someone almost larger than life appears on the scene of faith and does incredible, miraculous things with God working through him for the people of God? Would you agree or disagree with that? I mean, Billy Graham is larger than life in a very real respect. He's done some things that many of us will never do, you know, and God worked through him in a mighty and powerful way. Who was the first larger than life person that we studied in the pages of the Old Testament? Probably not Moses. He's probably the second. Probably Abraham was the first, and then probably Moses. I would venture that Samuel is now number 3 on that list, and I think the list is only 4 people. That's how important he was, not necessarily to the law that came to Israel, but the survival of Israel and the life of Israel, and making that transition from a loose group of tribes to a tight national unit. So we're going to talk a little bit about Samuel here, and we're going to have some background, and I'm probably going to keep referring to Samuel, and what I'm referring to is the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel combined. And I'm just referring to it as one book. And when you look at the Hebrew Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, if you will, what Jewish people, what they read, what they take to synagogue service and things of that nature, it doesn't have the New Testament, and so it's not the Old Testament they have, it's the Tanakh that they have. Samuel is just one book. And as far back as we can tell, Samuel was just one book. It wasn't until Jewish scholars around 250 BC translated the Hebrew into Greek that they actually split up Samuel into two books, and they called one of them 1 Samuel and the other one 2 Samuel. Now, think about this. You have papyri, which is about maybe that wide, and then it's pasted together, and so it makes a scroll. And you could have a scroll starting here, it could go all the way out the door and across 25th Street over to the other side. That still wouldn't be enough room to write all of Samuel. So when people are coming into the synagogue and places like that, when they are carting the scroll of Samuel around, they're doing something like this. And so when they split it in half, if you will, if they cut it in half and they called it 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, they did it more for convenience sake than anything else so that it could all fit on a scroll. And it wasn't until much later, after the New Testament was completed, that we actually had something that looked like this, like a book that was available and you could print on both sides of it. So that way, instead of carrying something like this around, you'd be carrying two like this around, but at least you'd be balanced as you're trying to walk out the door. And that's the origin of it. There's no indication of it being two separate works, but only one full, complete work up until 250 BC, which is when the Hebrew scholars in Alexandria, Egypt, translated the Old Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. And that's when they split it up. And so, based on that, between the Septuagint and the Catholic Old Testament, and if you can find a copy of the Catholic Bible that's got all 46 books, I guess it is, in their Old Testament in it, something like that, you're not going to find something that says 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. And Kings is the same way. It was just one document. They split it in half. It would be 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 3 Kings, and 4 Kings. Or 1 Reigns, 2 Reigns, 3 Reigns, and 4 Reigns. And they're talking about Samuel and Kings together. So how confusing is it if you pick up a Catholic Bible and say, well, I need to go to 1 Kings, and you're reading 1 Samuel? Because that's the way it works out. That's the way they refer to things like that whenever you look at the Catholic Bible. As with many Old Testament books, the book of Samuel is named for the first major character that comes from that book, of course, which is going to be the person of Samuel. Let me see. Will this work? I'm sorry? Oh, hey, this works. Why didn't it work on the keyboard? Oh, well. As we turn to the book of Samuel, there are some big changes going on. You know, we're talking bigger changes than Obama being replaced by Trump. Okay, that was, in the history of the United States, there was nothing quite like Obama being replaced by Trump from a political perspective. Well, there are some fundamental changes going on with Israel, because up until this point, what kind of government did Israel have? There was no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. They had little government at all. We could say that God's design was to have a theocracy, and that means He's on the throne and everybody just follows Him. And when they need a human being, God says, you, go take care of it. And that person that God chooses goes and takes care of it. They wanted a king. They clamored for a king. Who were those men that God designated to take care of things prior to the book of Samuel and Samuel anointing Saul? Judges. Moses is gone. Joshua's gone. That generation's gone. Judges. Otherwise, everyone is doing what they think is right in their own eyes. And so, think of it this way. You have an outrageously rebellious child. This child does whatever this child wants to do. This child has absolutely no regard whatsoever for you, has no regard for the things that you suggest or the things that you say or the things that you demand. And you're pulling your hair out. What am I going to do with this child? That's the period of the judges. Now, suppose that child enlisted in the army. What would that child be in for? A radical change, a rude awakening. What would you think of that child the next time you saw that child? Wouldn't recognize him if the army is successful. If the army is not successful, then there's absolutely no telling where you might recognize him next. That's kind of like what they were looking at. They're moving to a monarchy. What would it be like if we had a king here in the United States? Don't tell him that. What would it be like for us? It might not be a lot different because of all the things that we have in place already. You know? So, a dynasty is established in a monarchy, and the successor to the throne is usually the firstborn son. Or in that society, firstborn son. It may not be the case anymore in some monarchies. It could be a firstborn, whether son or daughter, in many places today. So what we have here is the period of the judges. Samuel, what we know as 1 Samuel, begins with the last of the judges. And we're in that transition time between no longer being during the judges and actually making that move into a monarchy. What would your child go through going from being a rebellious child under your roof to being a PFC in the Army? Quite a total. What? You mean that's not a suggestion? That's an order? Not the boss anymore? What is Israel going to have to go through? Growing pains? Well, we also not only see political changes, we see social changes for the nation of Israel. Because while they're wandering in the wilderness, they're all together in one place. They're one big happy family, so to speak. Okay? And the campground where all of them are living may be 2/3 the size of the state of Rhode Island, but still they're all together in one big place. And then after the conquest and during the period of the judges, they're just scattered to the four winds. And every tribe is kind of doing their own thing, and you got tribes in one region that may have a little bit to do with one another, and tribes. So it's a loose confederation of tribes. And now they're going to become a strong nation before we get to the end of Samuel. What happens to take a loose, disparate collection of tribes that seem to all be going their own direction to get them all on the same page to be going the same direction? It takes an act of God. It takes strong leadership. But that's what's going to happen by the time we get to the end of Samuel. There's a simple shrine at Shiloh. And what does David want to build before we get finished with Samuel? A majestic temple in Jerusalem. He's not able to do it, so it's built by his successor Solomon in the early chapters of 1 Kings. So a simple shrine at Shiloh. Boy, say that 3 times real fast. Simple shrine, Shiloh, simple shrine, simple shrine. To this majestic temple in Jerusalem. Different city, different kind of place, different kind of location, different atmosphere of worship altogether. The church that my son was serving up in Colorado, they were actually meeting in a variety of elementary schools. For the first however many years. And they would rent the space. They would have chairs. They would leave their folding chairs at the elementary school, and the elementary school could use them if they needed. And they would use some of the elementary school's folding chairs if they needed them. It had a really good working relationship. Janitor would show up, open up the place. They would work and do whatever needs to be done on Sunday morning. They would close it down, clean it up. The janitor would inspect. Janitor got paid overtime. School system worked really well with them. They found a building that they could call their own. It was already built. Talk about having a turnkey project. You know, you don't even have to wait for it to be built. They moved in $3.5 million debt. And the place, if I'm not mistaken, was 39,000 square feet. What kind of culture shock did they have? Suddenly moving into a place, first of all, that they couldn't afford, and secondly, that was overwhelmingly too large for them. And last I knew and last I was up there, they still had space there that was, I mean, they had storage space bigger than this building, just one room. Storage space bigger than this entire building because they didn't have anything else to do with it, so they just put stuff in there. It was wide open. Same kind of things that they're going through. They were nomads living in tents, raising critters. And now they're living in houses and they're tilling the soil. How different is this from the group that actually wandered in the wilderness? You wouldn't even recognize them. So as we look at Samuel, as we try to figure out when all of this takes place at the very beginning anyways, we run into a little bit of difficulty. I'm one of these that I like to know where it fits in the big scheme of things and what else was going on in the world and how long ago did this happen and all that sort of stuff. Unfortunately, Hebrew history and what is written down as Hebrew history isn't always necessarily intended to be chronological. Sometimes it's intended to be thematic. And so they talk about a lot of the same things at the same time, and then they back up and they talk about a lot of the same things, but they may be back up in time. And so you never know which direction you're going. That's not necessarily the case with Samuel. We're not 100% certain when the Exodus occurred. We're not 100% certain how long the period of the judges last. And so all that we can do is try to find some specific point in time that we can reliably date and work our way forward and backward from that, giving the years and everything that are recorded in the biblical text. And thankfully, we have something. Usually in that time frame, whenever kings went out and they won a magnificent battle, they raised this enormous monument to themselves. They said, "That's right, I defeated everybody." Well, there was this battle. It's called the Battle of Karkar. And Shalmaneser III of Assyria won that battle. And he erected this beautiful monument to himself called the Kirk Stela. And in that Kirk Stela, he talks about all the different people that he defeated, and he includes in there King Ahab, or King Ahab, of Israel. King Ahab of Israel is somebody we recognize from the book of Kings. And we can pretty reliably date that Battle of Karkar at 853 BC. So using the dates that we have in the book of Kings and the book of Samuel, working forward, working backward, it isn't really until about 600 BC that we can date anything with accuracy based on the biblical text, because this was still prehistoric times. They still didn't worry about conveying to us exactly when all that was. But we can date the events of Samuel to somewhere between 1050 and 970 BC. That makes it 3,000 years ago. Some of the literary characteristics of Samuel. This is not like reading Leviticus, folks. This isn't even like reading Exodus chapter 20. It says, "Thou shalt and thou shalt not." This isn't like reading poetry. This isn't like reading the prophets. This is actually reading like a novel, if you will. This is reading historical information, if you will. We're looking at the establishment and development of the monarchy, and we're reading about things that happened to the kingdom and the nation as a whole and how things progressed and all that sort of stuff. And that's good reading. That, for us, we like a lot of action. Go, go, go. This has a lot of action. There's a lot of sequence of events. We can understand all that. We can appreciate all that. There's also a lot of biographical material. I own a few biographies, and I enjoy reading them from time to time just to figure out who these people were and what things were like. And there's three primary biographies that we're going to look at in the book of Samuel. Samuel, Saul, and David. And we're introduced to Samuel and Saul and David in 1 Samuel. what we know as 1 Samuel. By the time we get to 2 Samuel, Samuel and Saul are dead. And all we have left is David. And so when you think about all those great things that David did, and you think about those stories of David, and you think about what David accomplished and the mistakes that David made and all that sort of stuff, it's primarily going to be 2 Samuel after he became king. If you're thinking about something that happened whenever David was running from Saul, that's primarily going to be in 1 Samuel. But make no mistake, Samuel was not written so it would be a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list. Samuel was not written to give a novel to Jewish people 3,000 years ago. Samuel was written to tell us more about God and God at work in the people of Israel and the blessings that came upon Israel when they followed God. Isn't that what God promised to the nation way back in Genesis 19 and in Genesis 17? Genesis chapter 12. 3 different occasions God told Abraham, your people will live in this land and they'll be blessed beyond their wildest dreams as long as they follow me. Exodus chapter 19. I will be your God. Will you be my people? And so Samuel talks about the transition from the time of the judges to the time of the monarchy, tells us how the monarchy was established, but also gives us a beautiful picture of what it's like when you have a king who follows after God's own heart. A friend of God. So, having said that, we're going to look at Samuel first because he's the primary person that we're in the first half of the first few chapters of the book of Samuel. And then we are brought into awareness of a person by the name of Saul. And Saul becomes king. And it's that whole transition from the time of the judges to the time of the monarchy and what was going on and all that was transpiring and all of that. And then at the end of all of that, God turns his back on Saul. You're not the king I want. And so Samuel anoints David. And so now we have 2 kings. Israel doesn't know it. They still see only one seated on the throne. But their vision of who's on the throne is different from God's vision of who is supposed to be on the throne. And so there's a struggle for power, Saul and David. And then during that time, Samuel dies. At the end of all of that, Saul dies. And then David becomes king over all of Israel in the beginning of 2 Samuel. Once he is firmly established, we start to talk about, okay, who's going to be David's successor? And then there's some appendices of things that David had to take care of, or David didn't necessarily have to, but chose to take care of at the end of 2 Samuel. So we're going to start with Samuel. Who is Hannah? Who else was Hannah? The wife of Elkanah. Yeah. Now, how many wives did Elkanah have? 2. He was married to Hannah, and he was married to an Italian grilled sandwich, panini or something like that. No, I think her name was Payne. So, what was Elkanah's first mistake? 2 wives? Yep, that was his first mistake. And we don't get very far into 1 Samuel before we read that. 1 Samuel chapter 1, there was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroam, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephrathite. He had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. There was a problem. What was the problem?
He liked Hannah better.
I'm sorry?
He preferred Hannah, but she had no children. So Peninnah kind of lorded it over her.
Yeah, Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. So Israel has no king. Everyone's doing as he sees fit. Peninnah has children. Hannah has none. Why would that cause friction? Jealousy. Why would Hannah be worried? So you got kids. Big fat hairy deal. I got Elkanah.
Because in that society,
Someone needled her? Someone?
because in that society, if you didn't have children, you didn't have anyone to take care of you once your husband died.
And if you were a a woman and you were married and you didn't provide children for your husband, you were not fulfilling your God-given goal in life, your God-given role in life. Drop down to verse 6. Her rival, Peninnah, used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. I can just see it now. Elkanah and Peninnah and Hannah, and they're getting ready to go. And Elkanah says, okay, I got all my stuff packed. Are you all ready to go? And Peninnah says, well, me and the kids are ready. Hannah, how about you and your kids? Oh, that's right. You don't have any kids. Or, something to that effect. Yeah. Something to that effect. And Hannah, unable to fully obey God, her role as a wife was to provide children for her husband. So what do you do if you want to follow God, but you can't? What do you do if you want to provide for your spouse and you can't? I'm sorry? You talk to God about the problem. What would you do in this society today? Or it's fine. It's someone else's fault. It's not my fault. Are you really sure Peninnah's kids are your kids, Elkanah? Something along those lines. But she talked to God. So in chapter 1, verse 3. Elkanah used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to her sons and daughters. But she had multiple children. She had at least 4 at this time. But to Hannah he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb, and her rival used to provoke her grievously, to irritate her. And so it went on, year after year. And as often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her, and Hannah would weep and would not eat. Now, husbands, if you're going to try to console your wife in her grief, what would you do? Well, this is what Elkanah did. Verse 8, Elkanah said, Hannah, why are you crying? Why don't you eat? Why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? He showed a remarkable ignorance of what was important to Hannah. And he had the audacity to say, what about me? Well, this particular year, after Hannah gets up and she goes off and they've had their meal, and the implication is they would bring the sacrifice in. They would, it'd be a sacrifice of thanksgiving or something along those lines, and then Hophni and Phinehas, or Eli, if it was Eli himself, would help, and they would sacrifice the animal, and some of the food, some of the meat that came from all of that, some of the grain that they brought, if they brought wine, some of the wine that they brought would all be part of a festival meal that would happen over there. And so they would go over there and they would have their festival meal based on this particular sacrifice that was going on. And, poor Hannah's getting picked on, and Elkanah's not showing a whole lot of discernment and a whole lot of support for her. And so she comes back over here to this side, and she starts to cry out to God in prayer. And the whole time that she's crying out to God in prayer, Eli, the high priest, is sitting over here, and he's watching what's going on, and he looks at her and he just shakes his head. Can't believe it. That woman's drunk. She's talking to herself. Her mouth is moving, not a sound coming out. Now, if you saw someone talking to themselves, what would you think? If you saw someone talking to themselves and no noise was coming out of their mouth, and what would you think? Schizophrenic? I was sitting at a red light, in Arlington, Texas one time. And I happened to look in the rearview mirror, and the car that was right behind me, single occupant, young lady sitting behind the driver's seat of that particular car. And I just hardly, it was so fascinating. She goes, she was singing. She was having a good old time. But usually, because we're human, we think, oh, golly. Oh, God. And that's exactly what's going on. Eli is witnessing the whole thing, and he comes to her. She is deeply distressed. Verse 10. She prayed to the Lord. She wept bitterly. Verse 12, as she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart. Her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. Eli took her to be drunk. And he said to her, how long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away from you. There is an insightful spiritual leader. Hannah answered, no, my Lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Eli realized he had made a mistake. He had judged her and judged her incorrectly. And so Eli said to her in verse 17, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. He blessed her. So now the only question is, what was the request that she made? How was it worded? And I kind of skipped over that just a little bit. Verse 11, she made a vow. Never make a vow unless you're willing to keep it. What did Jesus say about making vows? Let your yes be yes, and let your no be no. Anything beyond that is danger. I'm paraphrasing. He didn't say it's danger, but I'm paraphrasing. So she made a vow. Lord of hosts, if you will look on my affliction, on the affliction of your servant, and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give to your servant a son, I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. What is the vow? What is the bargain she's making with God? Okay, first of all, if you give me a son, he's yours. That's why I like what it says that she lent him to God all the days of his life. What else is part of this vow? Yeah, it's a Nazirite vow. No razor will touch his head. At this point, she hasn't even conceived, so the idea of not drinking anything from the fruit of the vine is out of the question. But when she said, no razor shall touch his head, that's what she meant. I'm giving him to you as a Nazirite. Who was the last Nazirite we saw? Samson. That's a pretty strong vow to make. Are we in the habit of making promises to God and not keeping them? Well, she was determined to keep this promise. Eli had two sons, just kind of what's going on. We read about them back up in verse 3. And the two sons were Hophni and Phinehas, and they served as priests. Unfortunately, Hophni and Phinehas weren't the best of people. Just to give you a little bit of a taste of what we're going to see in chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 12 actually calls the sons of Eli worthless men. And then a very staggering statement. Here they were priests of the Lord, serving as priests. And the last part of chapter 2, verse 12, they did not know the Lord. Okay. Chapter 2, verse 17, they didn't respect God. They committed adultery. Eli reprimanded his sons. So, let me see. I must have missed one. I guess it's that last one down there. It's the passage I read. I'm sorry, I'm going to back up. The passage that I read at the beginning, verse 24, when she had weaned him, when Hannah had weaned Samuel, she took him with her, along with the 3-year-old bull, an ephah of fine flour, a skin of wine. She brought him to the house of the Lord at Shiloh, and the child was young. And they slaughtered the bull, and they brought the child to Eli, and she said, my Lord, as you live, my Lord. I am the woman who is standing here in your presence praying to the Lord. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted my petition that I made to him, and I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. I jumped ahead of myself. I apologize. We have child dedication services. What does that mean? Yeah, it's more of a parent dedication than it is a child dedication. The parents are dedicating themselves to raising that child, and they want the child to grow up. So what does that mean for us in everyday practice in 2018 Alamogordo if we had a child dedication service? I'm going to make sure that kid's at church. I'm going to make sure that kid doesn't run with the wrong crowd. I'm going to make sure that kid has respect for God. I'm going to make sure that kid has respect for others. We'll say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and yes, sir, and no, sir, and grow up being a respectable child. What did it mean for her to dedicate Samuel to the Lord?
Back then, he had to go and become a priest.
Well, more than likely, the family was Levitical of Levitical descent in the first place. But yeah, he was going to become a priest. But what did it mean for her as a mom? She had to leave him. She left him there. Now, there's two statements in that passage that we just read. When she had weaned him, she went up, and the child was young. How old was Samuel when she left him with Eli at Shiloh?
He could have been going to 6 because they nursed their children for a long, long time.
They did nurse their children a little bit longer, but he may have been as old as 6, but probably 3 or 4. Hi. Remember me 4 years ago? I asked for this child. You thought I was drunk. You asked. Well, here he is. What is Eli thinking? His sons are already serving as priests. How old is Eli? What's he going to do with a 4-year-old? And get young again. Find energy he thought he didn't have anymore. Then the story fast forwards to a point in time when Eli is a little bit older. But in the meantime, we hear what's going on about his 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas. As I said a moment ago, chapter 2, verse 12, they were worthless men. You know, I've known guys that I wouldn't trust. I've known guys that, I wouldn't befriend him. But what kind of person is it that you would call him a worthless man? No redeeming value. Why? They did not know the Lord. Chapter 2, verse 12. They had no regard for God. They didn't care one whit about God. What do you have when you have someone as a priest who cares not for God, doesn't know God? What happens to the people? What happens to the sacrifices? What happens to the system? Not only that, dropping down to verse 17, it said, we'll start in verse 15. Moreover, before the fat was burned, the priest's servant would come and say to the man who was giving the sacrifice, give meat for the priest to roast, for he will not accept boiled meat from you, but only raw. And the man said to him, let them burn the fat first, then take as much as you wish. He'd say, no, give it now, and if not, I will take it by force. This sin of the young men was very great in the sight of the Lord, for the men treated the offering of the Lord with contempt. As priests, their food, their lunch, came out of sacrifices that were being given. That's how they ate. So when an animal was sacrificed and they got part of it, in this era, what they did was they would take some of the meat and they would put it in a big pot and they would boil it. And then they would take out a long fork and they would stick it down in the pot, and whatever came out was their portion for their lunch. What does boiled meat like as compared to roasted meat?
Kind of tasteless.
I'm sorry?
Tasteless.
Kind of tasteless? Yeah. They're wanting it fresh so they can roast it. Would you rather have boiled steak or grilled steak? Would you rather have boiled ribs or barbecued ribs? To me, it's a perfectly legitimate request, but it compromised the sacrifice. They did not respect God. And then in chapter 2, verse 22, Eli was old. He kept hearing all that his sons were doing to all Israel and how they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. They were committing adultery or committing prostitution, if you will. We have no record that both of these men were married. We only know of one that was married. So for him, it would have been adultery. But for the other one, if he wasn't married, it would have been prostitution. So your spiritual leaders, people who don't know God, people who have no respect for God, people who commit prostitution. What are the prospects for the people? Well, chapter 2, verse 25. We just read in verse 22, Eli was old and he heard all of that. And verse 23, why do you do such things? My sons, it's not a good report I hear. Verse 25, if someone sins against God, a man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against the Lord, who can intercede? He rebuked them. He reprimanded them. He told them, no, 1,000 times no. And as the good sons that they were, they quickly obeyed. Or, as verse 25 puts it, they would not listen to the voice of their father, for it was the will of the Lord to put them to death. However, don't miss verse 26. Now the boy Samuel continued to grow, both in stature and in favor with the Lord and with man. Where have we heard something that sounds like that before? About Jesus in the Gospels. He continued to grow in stature and in favor with the Lord and with man. Well, a man came and he prophesied to Eli, and in chapter 2, verse 34, the man who is speaking to Eli said, this shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. It will be a sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And that faithful priest is going to be Samuel. So Samuel has been with Eli since he was probably about 4 years old. What's Eli been doing with him? Training him, teaching him. Maybe he's taking him to go fishing, I don't know. But beyond that, he's training him, he's teaching him. What has his mother been encouraging all this time? She donated. She gave him to God. She dedicated him to God, lent him to God. 2 Samuel 2:18, Samuel was ministering before the Lord, a boy clothed with a linen ephod. Verse 19, and his mother used to make for him a little robe, oh my word, and take it to him each year when she went up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. She's encouraging this. What hat is Samuel wearing? What role is he performing? I'm sorry? Samuel? He's learning. He's a student, and he's learning to be a priest. He's learning to be a priest. Now, what hat do you wear? What role do you perform? Are you in training, as Samuel was at this point? Or do you actually have that role and you're actively fulfilling that role? Might be at different levels of learning. Why do we learn? I'm sorry? To grow. Do we learn for the pure sake of learning? Well, we need to, but do we, is my question. Do we sometimes learn just for the pure sake of learning? There's not necessarily anything wrong with that. Don't get me wrong. But we need to learn so that we can do. And that's what we see in Samuel. We see the situation setting itself up. We see that this is during the period of the judges, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And we see that that extended not only to the people of Israel, but to the priesthood as well. They did what was right in their own eyes. And we see one person who's growing in favor and stature with the Lord and with man. We see mom encouraging him. What else is he going? Okay, you're 4 years old and you're hanging around with an old grandpa figure. What are you learning? Besides, isn't there somebody else I can go do something with? Yeah, you're learning everything he can tell you. And Eli is priest, and he's given him all he can. He's training him to be a priest. He was learning so he could do.
He wasn't ever going to know anything else but that.
He really wasn't. He probably had an idea of what Hophni and Phinehas were like, even as a young lad under Eli's tutelage. But you kind of get the funny feeling that since he was set apart as a Nazirite from birth, that he was thinking to himself, why are they doing that? That's not right. You know? I'm sorry?
The cycle is going to come back around.
Makes you wonder if God was giving Eli another chance because he had two sons and he didn't do a very good job of that.
That seems to be a recurring theme in the Old Testament. Parents not doing a real good job with their kids. Yeah, that is sort of Eli's second chance to get it right with Samuel. But he had so much going for him that he didn't have going for him with Hophni and Phinehas. Because more than likely, whenever they were growing up, he was busy working. And he's probably busy training. He's probably not busy working. He didn't have the advantage of hindsight. How many of you would like to go back and say something to your children and all over again, brand new, do it differently? He had a chance to do it differently.
I think too, Hannah gave him a very good start.
Yeah,
She trained him very well.
she definitely encouraged him. A shining star, if you will, in the Old Testament about raising a child. She did give him a good start, and she did encourage him.
Not to take away from this, I just think it's important too that God followed through and gave her other children.
Yeah.
And he respected what she had done enough to give her happiness too.
Verse 20 of chapter 2, Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, may the Lord give you children by this woman for the petition she asked of the Lord. And they returned to their home. In verse 21, the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and bore 3 sons and 2 daughters.
I just think that's important.
Oh, yeah. If you're going to try to broker a deal with God.
Well, I just think it's important because
Yeah.
God fulfills you.
Yeah.
He knew her heart, and that she really, and he knew that she loved him so much. Because for a mother to give up a child is a really big deal, and back then it was really a big deal, especially a son. And I just think it was, to me, that was great that they included the fact that God blessed her.
And shut up her rival in the process, too.
Yes, yeah, I did it right.
Yeah, that grilled Italian sandwich. What's God training you for? One thing that we haven't talked about, what did Samuel and Hannah do for Eli besides give him a second chance? Eli wasn't even beyond training. Go ahead.
I feel like I talk too much, but he showed Eli that he was wrong and that there was more, like when he thought the lady was drunk and she was not.
Yeah.
So he kind of, that was like an aha moment, because then he realized maybe not to judge just on appearance.
Yeah, Eli had a little growing up to do, even though he was an old coot by this time. And God did something else. What did he do for Moses after he told Moses, you will not enter the promised land? He let him see it. He's giving Eli a glimpse of the future with Samuel, because it ain't going to be through Eli's line. Comments, questions? Father, may we be open to whatever you're training us to become, whatever you're training us to do. And may we put our hand to the plow. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.